Here with our last panel, and Lisa Armstrong, Professor Lisa Armstrong, who is in the program for study and women and gender, will be moderating and introducing the panelists. So welcome back and welcome to the panelists.
Yeah, thank you everybody. I'll keep it very brief because I think the conversations in this conference as a whole have been fantastic. So the more time we have to be in conversation, the better. So today I'm happy to introduce our three panelists. Aubrey Westphal from the Political Science Department of Wheaton College, Mayanthi Fernando from the Anthropology Department of UC Santa Cruz, and Doris Gray from Gender Studies in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences in Al Ahwain University in Ifrin, Morocco. So we'll begin and sort of go down the line just for ease.
Okay. First, thanks so much for having me. I'm honored to be part of this conference that's bringing so many wonderful and powerful women together, and I'm thrilled to share this panel with these amazing minds. I'm here because with my co-authors, Bajena Welburn, who's here at Smith, Özge Çelik-Russell, and Sarah Tobin, I wrote a book entitled The Politics of the Headscarf in the United States. It's being published by Cornell University Press and will be available this May. But I should tell you I'm a little bit trepidatious because it was experiences like yours that created the data that we investigated for our work. So this wasn't really the audience we were envisioning for the book, but I hope that if what I say interests or provokes you, that you will pick it up, give it a read, and get in touch with us because we'd love to continue the conversation that we hope to start with our work. Our work focuses on the way wearing the headscarf enables Muslim women to construct and navigate their intersectional identities in the American context. A rich body of literature has examined this question in relation to political and social identities in Europe, often focusing on the politicization of the practice within contexts that are hostile to public displays of religion, or more particularly hostile towards public displays of the Islamic faith. In these contexts, the headscarf communicates something that may be very separate from what the wearer herself intends when she wears the scarf as an expression of her personal piety and identity. It takes on a distinct social meaning in political space, sometimes demonstrating or being understood by non-Muslims to represent political defiance. In these contexts, the personal identities and intentions of the wearer can be overwhelmed by the official reaction to the headscarf, and personal identity construction and transmission is severely limited. Knowing this, my co-authors and I were interested in the way the headscarf demonstrates, creates, or limits the construction of Muslim American identity here in the United States, where the legal state remains neutral about personal religion and religiosity. Neither my co-authors nor I practice Islam. We are international, though not multiracial. We are interdisciplinary. And we wanted to be very careful to avoid placing our own interpretations and understandings on the practice. So instead, we endeavored to better understand the way Muslim American women are thinking about their head covering practices and to proverbially pass the mic to them, placing their understandings and insights within the wider scholastic context. To achieve our goals, our research involved a large survey of about 2,000 Muslim women and 17 focus groups with 72 women in 7 American cities with large Muslim populations. In the end, we spoke with Muslim women from a number of racial and national backgrounds who both do and do not cover, and who were born into Muslim families and those who converted to Islam. We were humbled by the eagerness and the kindness with which our research participants shared their experiences. Many of them traveled great distances to meet with us, or they emailed us long anecdotes and descriptions of their lives and their experiences. Based on the testimony of the generous women who gave us their time, our work discusses the ways wearing the headscarf accentuates Muslim identity. This process carries significant social and political implications for Muslim American women and for the communities they belong to. Within these communities, the headscarf identifies a religious individual, differentiates between Muslim communities, and serves as a point around which women create personal and collective understandings about what it means to be both Muslim and American. Such visible markers can create opportunities for engagement and social enrichment, where they help members of the same group identify each other and communicate with one another, or where they help members of different groups identify and reach out to each other for community building. However, they can also form the basis of discriminatory practices depending on who is the one responding. The head covering is a marker around which others, including covered women, create boundaries. Some people will use the headscarf as a unifying symbol around which to draw the boundaries of a community, and others see it as something that signals difference and conflict, both within the community and beyond it. What I'd like to focus on today is the way the Muslim American women we spoke to create and maintain multiple meanings and values through the practice of head covering, which shapes particular group identities and interactions, while simultaneously conveying religious value orientations that prioritize piety and modesty. The creative role gives Muslim women, as the most visible member of an identity group, unique and powerful agency to change the way that Muslim identity is projected and received by society. Much of our book examines the way this agency is translated into political activity and activism. When it comes to how the head covering intersects with the political lives of the women we surveyed and spoke with, we noticed strong activist trends around personalizing the headscarf and linking it to the political passions of the wearer. In many cases, this link was made with Islamically informed political activism, where political participation and religious lives are fused into central understandings about justice, fairness, and representation in the democratic context. For example, our survey and focus group participants explicitly connect the practice of head covering to politics of equality, feminism, and democracy. They sometimes do this in an effort to reinterpret the covering, thereby making the practice more relatable for the average non-Muslim American. An example here would be when a Muslim woman frames her head covering as a free expression of religious commitment in a manner that is analogous to clothing worn by nuns or Jewish people. Americans generally understand the motivation behind clothing choices in the Christian and Jewish tradition and believe that they are protected by civil liberties. Making the connection with Islamic clothing implicitly calls for comparable treatment. That said, when our research participants discussed their political values, they were almost always expressing the ways they reconcile their own contemporary values with the practice that is often associated with traditionalism. Even if the process of linking religious and political beliefs is deeply personal, in the United States, these efforts occur within a non-Muslim context that may be predisposed to assume head covering is motivated by oppression and chauvinism, and instead these women opt to transform the practice into a modern, empowered choice in a politically charged environment after 9/11. As we've heard today several times, the temporal marker of 9/11 is vitally important because it meant that almost overnight, as the most visible and easily identifiable members of their religious communities, covered Muslim American women are carrying the burden of the social politicization of their religious identities more than other members of their communities. Covered Muslim women became newly subject to American politics of racialization, exclusion, and othering. We have a long chapter on this in our book, in which we theorize a range of othering experiences, all the way from what we call benevolent othering, which is where women perceived more favorable treatment by virtue of their head covering, where they were treated more kindly than others around them, to exclusionary othering. And I'd be happy to talk about that a little more in the Q&A session if you're interested. Negative stereotyping and prejudices against Muslims following the 9/11 attacks strengthened some young women's determination to cover. Many of them covered or continued to cover in an effort to represent what they call true Islam and to set an example of a good Muslim. Others emphasized the importance of wearing the headscarf while going about daily tasks so that observers can associate the two images, one of a Muslim woman and the other of a person taking public transportation or going shopping or going to work or school in the minds of non-Muslims. In this sense, the headscarf is a tool to accentuate and highlight commonalities. One of the most important common American experiences the Muslim women assert through their head covering behavior is the appreciation of freedom. Though, again, I'm proverbially preaching to the choir here, due to mainstream assumptions made about head covering, I must emphasize that nearly every single one of our participants went out of the way to describe their head covering as a free and informed choice that yielded positive benefits for the wearer. The consistent defense of head covering as a free choice among our respondents directly relates to notions of feminism as a liberating ideology. One respondent explicitly said that her head covering was an emulation of her feminism because it incentivized her to assert and prioritize her identity and values. Testimonies about the way the headscarf allows women to escape sexual objectification and to reclaim personhood also speak to feminist ideals. So many of our respondents and participants described their belief that the headscarf provoked respectful treatment from men and removed considerations of sexuality and gender from male-female interactions, encouraging their male discussion partners to listen to their ideas rather than being distracted by their physicality. In addition to demonstrating feminist notions of equality and resistance to sexualization, through highlighting free choice, our participants are referring to the head covering as an exercise of their civil liberties, often quite explicitly. These respondents emphasize not only the national religious freedom, which provides an environment that allows them to cover or not in whatever way they like, but primarily communicate their conviction that covering is a proactive and empowered choice within a free context. These women describe themselves as true patriots who appreciated a country who appreciated a country that allowed the full expression of their identities and who didn't want to be anywhere else. It's important to note that some Muslim women we spoke to were overwhelmed by the burden of being a visible representative of Islam by virtue of their headscarf. Others were frustrated by the disproportionate political attention attached to the hijab and suggested that political energy would be better invested elsewhere. Some of these participants trivialized the head covering as just a piece of cloth. I think we saw some of that in the art earlier. And argue that debates about the head covering are a distraction in a time where there are enormous and more consequential social justice issues for Muslims and non-Muslims to work on. Whether our respondents viewed the head covering as a political mobilizer or a distraction, the Muslim ethics of dress and comportment provide a clear example of the flexibility of Islamic values and their adaptability to a non-Muslim context. We heard many examples of the way Muslim women adapt their head covering practices to conform with ethnic styles, personal styles, or social occasion. The attention given to the covered models, artists, and athletes similarly highlights the adaptability and variability of covering behaviors, giving lie to the non-Muslim assumption that head covering is homogenizing, identity erasing, and regressive, and demonstrating its capacity as a tool for identity transmission and expression within the bounds of religious modesty. In sum, my co-authors and I believe our book demonstrates the active, deliberate, and democratic agency of Muslim women in the United States today. Our results reveal the way covered women constitute an important, visible force behind a national movement that embraces an Islamically informed political activism entirely compatible with American understandings of citizenship and democracy. However, I don't need to tell you that this is not a universally held perspective, and that the current climate has become increasingly hostile towards Muslims. We know that. Many Americans consider Islam to be an anti-democratic political ideology, as well as a particularly menacing type of political threat. Those who hold these attitudes see a potential terrorist threat in every practicing Muslim in the United States, and particularly in the women whose visibility makes them vulnerable to this assertion. This has serious implications for Muslim American civil rights and their sense of belonging in our country. The everyday, sometimes violent experiences of othering by women who wear the headscarf in the United States warn us that our own political institutions and guaranteed protections for minorities may disappear if American society does not insist on substantive inclusion in the political and social sphere. Americans, and especially non-Muslim Americans, must advocate for inclusive institutions for minorities as part of the democratic process. A true democracy is only possible through participation, mindful pluralism, and appreciation for the many intersectional diversities from everyone. Thanks very much.
Should I just go? Can you all hear me okay if I sit back and, okay. So first I just want to say how happy I am to be in this mostly all-women's space. I went to an all-women's high school, all girls I guess we were, high school, and it's been a long time since I've been in this kind of just really vibrant, mostly single-sex environment, and I forgot how much I miss it and how valuable it is, and I really thank you for this opportunity. I also want to thank Janie for this invitation, my friend and colleague Mohammed Mek for suggesting my name in the first place, and Sarah Lark for all the logistical help. I also want to say how honored I am to be amongst this very formidable group of women and to be part of this ongoing discussion, and I feel like I've already learned a lot, and thank you for hanging in there for the last panel. I'm going to pick up the question of alliances across differences that came up in the first panel earlier this morning during the question and answer time. And so I just sort of wanted to situate my talk within the broader, some of the things that we've already talked about. And I want to begin with two gatherings. I'm an anthropologist. I have ethnographic anecdotes. The first was a May 2016 conference organized by non-mainstream anti-racist and anti-Islamophobia activists. Of the 17 speakers, 7 were Muslim women of color, including Siham Asbag of the association Stop Racial Profiling, Narges Bibimoun of the Women's March for Dignity, and Houria Boutelja of the Indigène La République Party. Indigène La République is indigène of the Republic, and indigène is difficult to translate. It referred to colonial subjects in the French Empire. I think the English term would be natives rather than indigenous. And the PIR, Parti des Indigènes de la République, redeploys it to designate the sub-citizen status of non-whites in contemporary France. And I'm setting this up for you because I'm going to talk about Boutelja later. A year earlier, the PIR had held its 10th anniversary celebration with speakers made up entirely of minoritized women activists, 22 in all, many of them publicly and devoutly Muslim. These two gatherings represent a critique of both mainstream French feminism and mainstream French anti-racism, a critique that reflects the entangled nature of discrimination against Muslims in France. Muslim is now a quasi-racial classification to refer to people of North and West African descent. Muslims are therefore targeted on the basis of their race, often at the hands of police, and their religion, often through discriminatory laws like the 2004 banning of conspicuous religious signs, i.e. headscarves, in public schools, and the 2010 banning of face veils in all public spaces. Yet anti-racist groups, because of their zealous attachment to secularism, refuse to defend publicly observant Muslims. Moreover, perhaps because they are so close to center-left political parties, they also do not fully grasp the institutional nature of racism in France. With regard to mainstream French feminism, its antipathy for religion generally, and for Islam especially, not only excludes Muslim women from its ranks, but also makes French feminism basically incapable of addressing anti-Muslim forms of racism and sexism. It's worth noting that the two veil laws I just mentioned were passed with strong support from most mainstream feminist organizations, and little opposition from the mainstream anti-racist organizations. In fact, none of the mainstream anti-racist organizations came out against the 2004 headscarf law that essentially denied Muslim women in headscarves, Muslim girls, an education. In contrast, a new generation of activists, led by women, including publicly observant Muslim women, are trying to think about the multiple and entangled forms of discrimination, fighting racial profiling, police brutality, mass incarceration, and the general crackdown on Muslim civil liberties as part of a broader system. What I want to do today is track the various elements of this struggle and the history of this new generation, and in so doing, to map out different modes of feminist thinking and action, which I'll schematize very broadly as intersectional, decolonial, and Islamic, as well as identify some important fissures among these different modes. I'll work through these different modes by focusing on 3 individual theorists and activists, Siham Asbag and Houria Boutelja, who were at the 2 gatherings with which I opened, and Zahra Ali, a scholar and activist. And I want to sort of make very clear that I'm engaging with these 3 as theorists and not simply activists or ethnographic objects, right? These are women with whom I'm very much in conversation, and I really want to make that sort of clear, that their praxis is a form of theory. And they're also writing and theorizing sort of more explicitly. I should also note that these and other activists draw inspiration from Black, Chicana, and post-colonial feminist currents in the United States, including Black feminists' focus on political violence, on police violence and mass incarceration, and Muslim American scholars' reinterpretations of the Quran and Sunnah. This new generation of Muslim women was galvanized by 2 watershed events. The first was the fatal electrocution in October 2005 of 2 non-white teenage boys, Bouna Traoré and Zayed Benna, who were chased into a power station by police in an immigrant suburb or banlieue of Paris. The boys had reason to run. Racial profiling is rampant in France, and police are notorious for random identity checks and subsequent detentions of non-white youth for minor infractions. Moreover, racial profiling and a structurally racist criminal justice system mean that Arab and black men, about 8% of the population, comprise up to 50% of the prison population. The two boys' deaths sparked massive civil unrest across France, called riots, with young men burning cars and confronting riot police. In response, the government declared a state of emergency, the first in metropolitan France since the Algerian War. The second watershed event was the 2004 headscarf law, which had the effect of spawning new alliances between observant Muslims, non-mainstream anti-racist activists, and radical white feminists, the latter outraged, and they were really a minority, but the latter outraged by the laws denying young women an education. One such alliance was the Feminists for Equality collective, Collectif Féministe pour l'Égalité. Restricted to women, the collective brought together established white feminists with younger Muslim activists, many of them practicing. The collective sought to show how gender discrimination was always connected to other forms of discrimination as well as to expand the definition of emancipation to include religiously inspired modes of liberation. It sought, in other words, to pluralize feminism, hence the careful choice of its name, Collective of Feminists rather than Feminist Collective, and this works more interestingly in the French. Explicitly foregrounding the possibility of being Muslim and feminist, the group's manifesto was called Inshallah l'égalité, equality, God willing. Tensions soon emerged within the group, however. A number of Muslim women felt that despite the careful naming, certain modes of women's liberation were privileged over others, and that white feminists continued to set the collective's agenda. For example, devout Muslim women could not sign on to the unrestricted right to abortion, a longtime feminist priority to which many secular members of the collective remained committed. Other less devout Muslim women were indifferent to, rather than ethically uncomfortable with, the key feminist issues of abortion and same-sex marriage. They argued that racism, police brutality, and other forms of state violence were far more pressing issues to minoritized subjects in France. These various critics broke away from the collective to form smaller groups with different approaches. The first approach was that of the short-lived association Féministe Indigène, which inaugurated an intersectional perspective in France, one that sees feminism as a struggle against, simultaneously, racism, classism, and sexism. The association's charter stated its refusal to, quote, be silent in our feminist struggle under the pretext that the anti-racist fight is primary, nor would its members be silent in our anti-racist struggle by serving as an intermediary in the name of a pseudo-feminism in the demonization of Black, Arab, and Muslim men, unquote. Sharing this intersectional perspective is Siam Asbag, currently spokesperson for the association Stop Racial Profiling, though she was not a member of Féministe Indigène. As she told a journalist in 2015, quote, I'm a woman, but my identity is multiple. I'm also of Moroccan origin, I'm also a Muslim, and I'm also from a poor neighborhood and working class family, unquote. Indeed, Asbag came of political age with the electrocution of Bouna and Zayed in 2005. She was 18 years old at the time and felt, she has said, a sudden sense of kinship with those banlieue youth, the sense that, quote, my brothers were dead, and that everywhere they were in revolt, unquote. Horia Boutelja, once a member of the Féministe Indigène and now the spokesperson of the Indigène La République party, has largely turned her back on feminism, though she's willing, she writes in her recent book, Whites, Jews, and Us, to use the concept of decolonial feminism. Boutelja is a controversial figure in France. She sees feminism as, at best, irrelevant to the struggles of minorities. The historical and political specificity of feminism's emergence in the North Atlantic makes it untranslatable to other struggles, she says. And, at worst, an attempt to make Muslims conform to the dictates of the white majority in France. The real struggle, she told me recently, has been about the violence of the state. Her book cites former Black Panther Assata Shakur's statement that we can never be free while our men are oppressed. Following this line, Boutelja calls the critique of Arab Muslim patriarchy by Arab Muslim women a luxury. She seems to posit a clear hierarchy of priorities, fight racism first, then patriarchy, because, she writes, any critique of non-white men is so easily co-opted by the state to further stigmatize them, which is something that we brought up today, this morning. But she also argues that racism exacerbates, even generates, gender violence and inequality in the banlieue. According to Bouteja, symbolic male castration, and I'm quoting her, male castration, a consequence of racism, is a humiliation for which men make us pay a steep price, unquote. So one cannot, according to her, improve gender relations without first addressing racism. Bouteja is also quite critical of Islamic feminism for accepting the terms of Euro-American feminism, including the primacy of gender equality, and working to fit Islamic norms into those terms. Muslim feminists, she says, and I quote, remain prisoners to the terms of a debate imposed by others, unquote. Needless to say, these are unpopular opinions, and Bouteja has few allies. I include her here because she's a major public presence in France, and I find her provocations, as much as I may disagree with them, I find her provocations productive to think with. While Asbagh and Bouteja certainly see themselves as Muslim, their Muslimness is more a cultural or racial identity than a religious or ethical norm. In contrast, a number of activists have taken up the mantle of Islamic feminism. These activists have found inspiration in work by scholars like Amina Wadud and Kisha Ali, who are here today, and Asma Barlas and Asma Lamrabe. Unlike secular feminists, Islamic feminists begin with the premise that the Quran constitutes divine speech. From that basis, they argue that equality is the founding principle of Islam and that the Quran endorses equality between the sexes. Thus, Wadud's Quran and Women reinterprets passages used to justify sexist and misogynist practices and argues for very different interpretations. In a similar vein, Barlas claims in her influential Believing Women in Islam that the Quran is explicitly egalitarian and anti-patriarchal. Wadud, Barlas, and others argue that Islamic teachings used to justify the gender inequality endemic to so many Muslim societies today derive not from the Quran, but from exegesis, tafsir, undertaken for centuries by men whose own misogyny has come to eclipse the revolutionary message of Islam and of the Prophet Muhammad. Much of this work was gathered in one volume, translated into French, and published in 2012 as Islamic Feminisms, Feminisme Islamique, by Zahra Ali, now teaching at Rutgers University. Ali has been an activist since she was a teenager, first with a Muslim women's group in her hometown of Rennes in Brittany, and then with the Feminists for Equality collective that I mentioned. And I knew her when I was doing field work when she was like 17 or 18, so it's actually really cool to watch her become an academic and my colleague, basically, right? Although Islamic feminism has existed as a field of scholarship and activism for decades elsewhere in the world, Ali's book was really the first of its kind in France. Nonetheless, the ideas articulated in Feminisme Islamique have been circulating informally in Muslim French women's reading circles for over a decade. These young women have long sought to distinguish between the patriarchal cultural traditions of the Maghreb and original Islamic principles. These young women criticize the sexism of conventional Islamic exegesis and jurisprudence and explore new ways to conceptualize Islam. This should all be very familiar. They are just as critical, however, of mainstream feminism's claim that women's emancipation entails the rejection of religion and religious norms. As Islamic feminists, they argue they can be both devout Muslims and committed to gender equality. They also argue that because emancipation can take multiple forms, alliance building can only occur when, as Ali writes in Feminisme Islamique, quote, certain agendas and priorities in the struggle are not imposed on others, and where there's a real recognition of the plurality of ways to fight for women's rights, unquote. But what does this plurality entail exactly? Having laid out these three broad approaches, intersectional, decolonial, and Islamic, I want to think through some of the fissures between these different currents and between these currents and secular feminisms. After all, as Barlas notes, there are significant points of tension between Islamic and secular feminisms. The Quran's concern with bodily modesty is based on a view that all bodies, not just female ones, are potentially erotic. But if that view is fundamentally at odds with conservative ideas about women's sexuality, it is also at odds with most Western feminist views of the body, since a potentially erotic body needs to remain modestly covered and private. Barlas is right that attitudes toward the body can be a major source of contention between different ethical and political currents, And I turn now to the secular feminist slogan, "My body belongs to me," and to two different critiques of that concept from, respectively, the Islamic feminism of Zahra Ali and the decolonial perspective of Huriya Bouteja. In 2005, many non-Muslim members of the Feminists for Equality Collective wanted to march as an organization under the slogan, "My body belongs to me," in French, "Mon corps m'appartient," in a demonstration celebrating the 30th anniversary of the legalization of abortion in France. "My body belongs to me" is, of course, an iconic declaration, not just in the context of abortion rights, but within secular feminist conceptions of women's agency more generally. However, many Muslim women in the collective balked. "My body doesn't belong to me," Ali later told me, recounting this disagreement. "It belongs to God." To claim otherwise would be to usurp divine sovereignty. Ali and others felt deeply uncomfortable, ethically really incapable of marching behind such a slogan. Secular feminists found this position galling. They had supported Muslim women's rights to wear the headscarf, they said, as part of a fundamental right to choose what to do with one's own body. How could their Muslim allies not reciprocate? Muslim women, in turn, were stung by what Ali called a summons to return the favor, and many in the collective left, not because they couldn't work with women who supported abortion rights, but because they felt their own position was not respected by secular allies who seemed, as Ali put it, to be waiting for them to evolve to the correct position on agency. Now, I tell this story to foreground how difficult it can be to build alliances, not only across political but also ethical divides, despite the best of intentions. Indeed, I wonder about the secularity of the conventional concept of the political and how one does political action, which seems premised on alliance building, which itself seems premised on a kind of trading of interests, as if these various interests are interchangeable and therefore exchangeable. Here, abortion and veiling become coextensive. I support your right to the first, your interest. You support my right to the second, another interest. It's worth considering the genealogy of this liberal notion of politics as the play of interests, which Talal Assad locates in the liberal state's dependence on early modern arguments for capitalism, in which, quote, "the idea of interest increasingly displaced the idea of passion as the principal mode of politics. The good that is calculable, economic value, was considered superior in politics to the good that isn't, religious value, because only the former could be conclusively assessed," unquote. This dispassionate rationalist trading of interests that has come to define the political makes it difficult to countenance a different mode of being, where one doesn't hold exchangeable interests, but is rather held by ethical obligations. And here we return to the non-autonomous, non-sovereign subject who belongs to, is held by God, a mode of obligation that anthropologist Elizabeth Pavanelli has called deontic rather than rationalist. Interestingly, Bouteja and the PIR have explicitly rejected the trading of interests or quid pro quo arrangements as a form of political action. They demand support for their causes without having to return the favor on questions of, say, LGBT and abortion rights, among others. This has made them unpopular with other leftist groups. But in her book, Bouteja lays out a clear sense of ontological heteronomy, of the way an individual is held by obligations to and relations with others. Also taking up that iconic feminist slogan, Bouteja writes, and I quote, "My body does not belong to me. I belong to my family, my clan, my neighborhood, my race. I belong to Algeria, to Islam. I belong to my history, and God willing, inshallah, I will belong to my descendants," unquote. What she means is that the very notion of the autonomous monadic individual acting alone and unaccountable to others is a liberal humanist fantasy, one that depoliticizes decolonial and anti-racist struggles. In many ways, Bouteja's framing maps onto recent feminist theories that posit human being, human ontology, as always relational, always contingent on others. And Bouteja's framing also gives conceptual heft to what I mentioned earlier, of being held by claims and obligations to kin, to community, to God. At the same time, Bouteja's invocation of God's will in the quotation I read, "I belong to my history, and inshallah, I belong to my descendants," this mention of Allah is rather puzzling because God is otherwise fairly absent in Bouteja's account of the world and of politics. Indeed, unlike Ali, for whom God is constantly present and sovereign, Boutelge's point is that her body belongs to her community, not to herself, nor to God. And while the communalism of Boutelge shocks certain liberal humanist sensibilities, it is nonetheless deeply secular. Though she mentions God again in her conclusion, her sense of being a Muslim seems to be in relation to other Muslims rather than also to the divine. God has no real play here in the world of humans and therefore in the world of social relations or politics. In fact, Boutelge sees the return to Islamic principles on the part of many Muslim French as a retreat from politics, of, quote, Islam as refuge. And her critique of Islamic feminism is not only that it takes up Euro-American terms of debate, but also that it misrecognizes the source of patriarchy. She writes, quote, gender conflicts today are first and foremost determined not by the nature of Islamic societies, but rather by global economic and political structures and North-South relationships, unquote. What interests me about Boutelge's framing is how familiar it is to a certain secular Trotskyist third worldism that remains, like Boutelge, dismissive of religion as an opiate of the people, a fundamental misconception of the real struggle, which is economic and for Boutelge and decolonial thought, or much of it, racial. I've gone into some depth about this issue of ontological and bodily non-sovereignty and the notion of being held by obligations to God and kin in order to highlight some of the fissures between these various feminist approaches. I wanted especially to highlight how dissonant the ethical underpinnings of Islamic feminism are to many other currents. That even self-declared Muslims like Boutelge and secular feminists who have actively chosen to work with devout women are so dismissive of Islamic ethical commitments speaks not just to the difficulty of creating alliances across approaches, but also to the problem that non-secular or asecular worlds pose for conventional politics. My point, and I'll end here, my point isn't that alliances are impossible. Rather, I find the theory and praxis of women like Ali and Boutelge fruitful ground to radically rethink what we might mean by feminist alliances and what we might mean by politics. Thank you.
So my auntie provided a very good theoretical background to what I'm going to talk about. She took us across the Atlantic to France, so it's a short step across the Mediterranean now to Tunisia, and I hope you will mentally accompany me to North Africa. I'd like to address the title of this panel, Islam, Feminism, and Social Justice, and would want to start with some questions. Do we advocate for social justice for people, women, with whose life project we profoundly disagree? Where does feminism stand on social justice for Muslim women who, for example, oppose gay rights, whose opposition to Israeli politics is taken a decidedly anti-Semitic tone, and who believe that single motherhood is immoral? What if severe injustices happen to women who embrace such views? This is the case of Islamist women in Tunisia who were persecuted under the two regimes of Habib Bourguiba and Zine Labidine Ben Ali, overthrown in the uprising 7 years ago. When we talk about Muslim majority countries, we often pit the inequality as male to female inequality. I would like to emphasize, as you did, women to women inequality. That is secular versus Islamist women, so issues of social class and race. And solidarity amongst women often do not cross these boundaries. For the past 7 years, I have interviewed hundreds of women who were victims of severe human rights abuses under the two previous dictatorial regimes. The majority of these women were supporters or members of the then banned Islamist Nahda movement, now Nahda political party. The movement was hounded under Ben Ali, but won the first free and democratic elections held shortly after the overthrow of the Ben Ali regime. If these women were vocal activists, they were imprisoned. If they were merely spouses of husbands who were Nahda activists, they were harassed by police, sexually violated, expelled from university or their jobs, and their children were ostracized at school. Let me explain two of the most common Tunisian forms of persecution under the Ben Ali regime. One is called pointage. This refers to a system where women whose husbands were in prison had to report to a police station as often as 5 times a day, meaning it was impossible for them to hold a job or adequately take care of their families. They had to get police permission, for example, to take their children to a doctor, or get permission from the police to go to what the equivalent of a PTA meeting would be here in the United States. The other system is called couffin, basket. This refers to women who packed baskets full of food, blankets, medicines to take to their loved ones in prison. The Tunisian system was such that prisoners were very frequently moved from one prison to another without the families being informed where their husband was imprisoned. So if they would travel from a small town in the interior, Sidi Bouzid, to Tunis, taking half a day, once they arrived at the prison in Tunis, they found out that the husband had meanwhile been moved to another prison. So they were on the road for several days just carrying these couffins to their loved one, which again meant that they had to put their children into the care of their extended family, who often opposed the political convictions of the person who was incarcerated. Secular women's rights associations, often with the support of their counterparts in the West, admit to not having come to the defense or aid of these persecuted Islamist women because they agreed with the dictatorial government's assertion that these women were enemies of a modernizing state. When I started my own research 7 years ago with women who were either in prison or were wives of former prisoners, I was very frequently accused of being an Islamist sympathizer. My position, however, is that human rights are not divisible and cannot be selectively applied. Moreover, I think we need to be careful not to create a hierarchy of grievances where one person's suffering is more important than another person's suffering. I have listened to hundreds, countless of horrific stories of abuse, violence, rape, extreme social exclusion and isolation, and have written extensively about that. Now Tunisia is going through a process of what is called transitional justice. Transitional justice is the process where violations that occurred under the previous regime and were considered legal under a previous regime are by international human rights norms crimes. So the most famous of these transitional justice processes would have been the Nuremberg trials after World War II, then the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Rwanda post-genocide, Chile, Argentina, and former Yugoslavia. Transitional justice process mainly encompasses 4 mechanisms: criminal justice, truth-seeking via truth commissions, reparations, financial, medical, and psychosocial, and institutional reform. My focus has mostly been on the Truth Commission. Very shortly after the fall of the Ben Ali regime, Tunisia enacted a very comprehensive organic transitional justice law, and soon thereafter created a Truth and Dignity Commission. It's the first commission of this kind in the world that has the name dignity in the name. Karama, as you might remember, was the rallying call of the uprising. Dignity also refers to the fact that crimes committed against women are often dignity crimes. So the term dignity in the Truth and Dignity Commission also acknowledges the suffering or the persecution that women experienced. What, in my view at least, are the results of this state-sanctioned hounding of Islamist women? The most important consequence, in my mind, is the destruction of the family. Violence against women, especially sexual violence, in a country where a family's honor rests in the modesty of its women, leads to self-loathing, shame, frustration, and contributes to a cycle of violence. Likewise, men who return from torture chambers are incapable of resuming normal, healthy family relationships, and again, continuing the cycle of violence, mistrust, and shame. Under the regimes of Bourguiba and Ben Ali, people lived in fear, and fear not only of the state or the police, but fear of being betrayed by their families, by their neighbors, and by their communities. How do children grow up into healthy adults if very early on they are taught and experience not to trust anybody? Not their classmates, not their teachers, not their family, and certainly not any state institutions. A society in which members have lived in fear of the state, betrayal by the family, cannot, in my view, embark on a smooth transition to an open, free, and democratic society. Trust amongst members of a community and basic confidence in the works of state institutions, in my view, is a critical building block of a democratic society. If women's experience of persecution, oppression, violence, harassment, extreme social isolation on account of their convictions or the fact that they were related to someone who was a political activist, is not taken into adequate consideration, it will be impossible to build a democratic society. The Truth and Dignity Commission received about 16,000 dossiers in writing, out of which several hundred were called for oral testimony, and about a dozen were called for televised public testimonies, that all of Tunisia was glued to the television when these testimonies were given. They were simultaneously translated into French, Spanish, and English, so they were televised and via Facebook made available worldwide. Coming back to the beginning, where do we as feminists stand in defending human rights of those whose worldview we do not share, maybe even despise, and how do we engage productively with such communities? How do we promote, embrace, and live social justice without either supporting certain privileged communities or creating new exclusionary communities of privilege? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll open up the floor now for questions. There's a mic here, if it might help us all hear. Yes. Let me know.
Can you just yell?
I can't tell.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, there it is.
Now I can. All right.
Okay, so I'm not really sure how to come up with a question for this, but I'm very curious about the critique of the language used in Islamic feminism with regard to its objectives. And I want to problematize this potential location or understanding of some type of language that's disconnected to our current realities. We currently live in the nation state, who are members of certain types of international cooperatives, and in both of these places there is language that is being promoted as universal in the context of issues like human rights, and I'm unsure whether or not this stance is I think abysmally utopic or naively nostalgic, like there's somehow some language that's disconnected to the amalgam of the realities that we live in, shaping all the discourse over how we approach issues of justice, equality, and human dignity. So I don't understand what other language you can have. I do understand that epistemology matters. That is how the understanding of those concepts, might be arrived to. But I don't understand what other language can be used as in such a way that it does not trivialize what is in fact the objective of galvanizing a framework for being able to address the gross levels of inequality and injustice and in fact human rights violations that go on. So you named the three people. I tried to remember who they were. I think it's Ali. So I just don't want to understand, does she offer some type...
Are you talking about Boutelja's critique of the way that, are you talking about her kind of critique of the framing of gender equality as a framing?
Yes, the critique of Islamic feminism because it's using the language of the state or, whatever. I don't know what other language there is, and I do know that the engagement with the parameters of those discourses have been very specific in the Islamic feminists that I know, in order to be able to not reduce any of them to a single form of them that has been problematic. So we reclaim the right to be able to define Islam, and we reclaim the right to be able to define feminism, and we do work in the rubric of human rights. But I don't know another language to go with that, so I was just curious.
I think and I should say, I sort of don't want to speak for her, nor do I want to make any claim that I don't necessarily agree with the critique. I do think it's interesting though, because I think one of the questions, one of her basic questions is, why do we even have to identify as feminists in the first place, right? So what's the weight of that term, in a sense? And what's the sort of, how does this, and Ali would disagree, but it's her, Ali, talks about a kind of summons that many Muslim women are kind of compelled to answer. Are you or are you not? Are you tolerant of gays? Are you not? Are you homophobe? Or are you not? Are you feminist? Or are you not? Are you this? Or are you that, right? And it's that sort of move that I think Boutelja is trying to just get out of the very term. So I think, to go back to Inas, is that your, yeah. I think, you sort of asked, when the question is asked, is Islam tolerant or intolerant of gays and lesbians, of homosexuals, of queers? And you said we need to think about why the question is being asked and who's asking the question. And I think she would even go a step further and say we need to get out of this term of tolerance, intolerance, right? The very framing of the question, in fact, is the problem. So it's not just who's asking the question and why is the question being asked, but like how can we think outside of the terminology that is so currently in use. That said, so I'm kind of trying to ventriloquize in some sense what I think her response to your question would be, and I think I think there are lots of problems with that position, but that's what she's trying to do in a sense. And so for her, and it goes back, again, I want to kind of link it back to the panel earlier today, this morning. I think it goes to sort of Suad's question as well, and this is partly what she's trying to do when we talk about, violence against women, right, and we talk about human rights. That's all well and good, but which communities then get interpolated as, what are the consequences of that discourse on certain communities and not on others, right? So let's sort of be aware of how, not just how only certain communities are being interpolated in the first place with this question, are you tolerant, are you not, are you feminist, are you not, but also then how answering that question and how using those very terms of debate has these other effects that we may want to think about. I know that you would disagree. I mean, I think there are lots of people here who would disagree, but that's her position.
Yeah, I think that apparently there is some significance given to certain words over and above the way in which they're actually used in Islamic feminism, because there's no discourse in Islamic feminism about the significance of feminism. There is a discourse about how it is necessary to be able to claim things on your own terms, and that is what I call Islamic feminism. But I am on record to say it doesn't matter if you're feminist or not, because the objective, this is where I fall into the language that I know in terms of human rights and dignity. The objective is, the honor and dignity of every human being, but that language is shaped completely by, middle of the 20th century establishment of the United Nations, So I don't know another language, but yeah, I know a whole lot of languages other than feminism. I certainly never use the word tolerance, because it's unfortunately a time-specific and a circumstance-limited kind of term. It relates to only a particular circumstance, and it doesn't relate to comprehensive notions of equality and justice, which for me are actually Tawhidic. So I actually go from the Tawhidic paradigm in terms of what I'm asserting. But I'm trying to show the corollary between really the common understandings of issues like human rights. So I'm a victim of the reality of the era in which I live, but hopefully not bounded by that. I'm just curious, how do we actually devise a language that somehow is going to be unfettered by our mutual location in the post-United Nations era, for example.
I have another question for Mayanti. Huria Butalja is someone who interests me a great deal. And I think what you described as sort of, a Muslim identity without God in the prioritized position is interesting in the French context because of what I'm going to call like cultural Muslims. Right, or les musulmans du Ramadan, people who do Ramadan. It's another way of describing it, and I think a running theme of this conference has also been the fact that when we use words like a community under siege or in crisis, there's this rapprochement or coming together of the religious Muslims and the cultural Muslims, right? And the lines are being blurred, and I think one interesting facet of that is how Huria presents herself.
Yeah.
And it's kind of related to what you said, Suad, about the different sort of fashion choices and where to situate, for instance, her head covering. Is it a cultural symbol or a religious symbol? And how much of religious cultural attachment is part of the backlash against Muslims? And if we're coming to something which is not religious at all, which is just a cult, like a secularized religious identity. And we talk about that in other contexts, right? And because you related what she does to like some forms of Marxism and so on. Yeah.
I think that's very specific to her kind of critique, right? I totally take your point that there's this this kind of spectrum in some ways, which is I think worth taking into consideration, especially in France. And I don't want to make this forum all about, especially since she's not here, which I feel sort of bad about. You should read her book, though. It's been translated into English, and it's available. Semiotext translated it. It's pretty great. It's short, easy read. Not easy, but Anyway, two things. One, I've actually asked her because she presents on television and in public with a scarf, like a sort of wrap scarf, but it's not something that she sort of. It's a kind of, she has a public persona in a sense, and so. And part of what she's doing is also playing with people's expectations of what she's then supposed to say and do, right? And a kind of expectation. She's sort of, for lack, she's kind of screwing with a white secular French public and how they might read her, because she's not as she is read, and I think that's really interesting. But I do think that her, and this is why I call her theorist. She is theorizing. Via conversations with other decolonial thinkers and other sort of leftist thinkers to try to figure out precisely a language that is maybe not entirely original, because I think as Dr. Woodard said, there isn't sort of an original language that's just out there waiting to be taken, but she is trying to come up with a sort of non-dominant reading of the world, including its terms and the network of concepts that those terms are a part of. So I think part of that is rethinking precisely the relationship between, or rethinking, in some ways the relationship to the divine as well, and in terms of what it means to be Muslim.
I have a question that follows up, Mayanti, on that comment. I wonder if you can speak, just revisiting the title of your talk, Intersectional Islamic and Decolonial Feminisms in France. I wonder, what struck me about Whites, Jews, and Us is how much destabilization she was engaging in. And I wonder if you can speak to her, perhaps, the kind of theoretical praxis that might yield the type of vocabulary that you're gesturing toward, whether destabilization is constitutive of a new vocabulary.
I think what you're asking, so it's Mona Arabi, and we've been in conversation about Huriya's book, but one of the interesting things that you're talking about, the book is, in French, it's called Les Blancs, les Juifs et nous. And she sort of talks about nous les indigènes, and the movement is called Les Indigènes la République. And I would say the sort of more conventional translation was what I sort of said about like natives of the Republic, basically, right? The British colonial term would have been like the British called their colonial subjects natives, which is what the French are doing. They call their colonial subjects indigènes. The book was translated in English. Indigène was translated as indigenous, which is really interesting, right? Because indigenous has a different valence here. But I think this is one of those moments of destabilization where I think she's really trying to broaden, to kind of make a movement, right? And kind of expand what we might mean by indigenous. That hasn't really been taken up. I don't know how that's going to get taken up by people who are in a more conventional indigenous rights framework, right? But it is one of these category shifts that I think she's trying to enable, which is why I find her a really interesting and provocative thinker, even though I may not agree with all of her analysis.
I mean, isn't the subtitle for a politics of revolutionary love?
Towards a politics of revolutionary love.
That changes things.
Yeah. It's interestingly, it's not. There's no subtitle in the English. Oh, there is. Okay.
Towards the politics of revolutionary.
Okay. Yeah, next time you have one of these conferences, you should just invite her.
Well, I actually have a specific question for you about The Voice and Manal Ibtisam. She was a Syrian woman with a headscarf who sang Leonard Cohen and then sang an Arabic song. Or, I don't know what I don't know where the Arabic lyrics came from, but I showed it to a class and I said, this is very interesting to understand the situation with Arabs, Islam, and France, and especially for a French judge to hit the button as she was singing in Arabic and come see a head-covered woman. Of course, there have been women who sang in Arabic on The Voice before. But then there was fallout, right? People searched for her tweets, and she was forced to resign from the competition. I just wondered, some of the interlocutors you were talking about, but also more so your opinion on the reception of that moment and the response.
Of that particular moment, with The Voice.
With The Voice.
I have to say I didn't really follow it, so I can't comment on it. It doesn't say a little bit more about.
Did you didn't see it?
No, I didn't.
Okay, so this woman with a headscarf, Manal Ibtisam, who we later revealed is Syrian, was singing Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah. And all the judges on The Voice turned around, but there was one remaining judge who turned around after she switched into Arabic.
Oh, so they couldn't see her.
Right, exactly. And then after that, she got a minute standing ovation. So it was almost like, I don't know, it felt like a France congratulating itself for that moment. And then there was a search for her political tweets, which were not the smartest tweets to write, being skeptical about what happened in Nice. And then there was really severe backlash. So she was forced to resign.
Right. I mean, so off the cuff, that doesn't surprise me at all. I think you were saying last night about misunderstood about visiting France and how awful it was, and that was like the one place that you just never would go back. And I turned to, I can't remember who it was who was sitting next to me, Sadia, I think, and I was like, that's just totally unsurprising, right? Completely unsurprising. I mean, I think it's sort of difficult to wrap one's head around just not just the sort of Islamophobia that, is obviously rampant in this country too in different ways, but the sort of, the way in which the headscarf is just such a it sets off people in a way that I still don't quite understand, to be perfectly honest. And I've worked on this for years and years and years and years. I mean, I understand on a historical level, I understand all of that, but on an affective level, I have to say I just do not. But I do also at the same time, I would be really curious about the audience, like who's in the audience for The Voice and who was clapping and who gave her a standing ovation.
But I think the tweet that was objectionable, that she said the real terrorist is the French state, not the one who killed all these people in Nice.
Right.
So that,
I mean,
if you're thinking about, like, she's coming from a Syrian legacy, right? Where the French bombed Syria multiple times. So
that to me is not a tweet that's worthy of, having. That is such a source of controversy. And Boutelja, as many of the things that Boutelja says, she has to have police protection because she has received so many death threats. She is a hated figure in France, which is partly why I wanted to talk about her today, because I think it's really important to have those kinds of voices, have a bigger public, especially outside of France.
So one interesting thing in all of your presentations had to do, whether it was very explicit or in the case of the Islamists somewhat submerged, with the veil and with women as political subjects and as a security threat. And particularly for Aubrey, I'm wondering if you could speak to this moment in the US. And I read something really smart about this recently, and you'll pardon me for forgoing the citation because at the end of this very long day, it has completely fallen out of my head. It'll come back to me later. This moment where veiled women go from being oppressed to being threatening. Right, and on the one hand, the Muslim woman is other because she's being suppressed, and that's part of what makes the Muslim man so awful, right? And then the reverse of that, or the flip side of that, or some new way to other Muslim women is that she herself is kind of a terrorist and a threat. And that's a tricky shift to manage because it creates a kind of cognitive dissonance between the two levels. But it is important, and it seems like we're at a kind of pivotal moment in our unsettled republic where this notion of Muslim woman as threat is increasingly an issue. And I wondered if you could speak to that. And, perhaps, Doris, you have some thoughts there as well from the Tunisian context.
Sure, yeah, I think it's a very, very difficult line to walk for these Muslim women who understand that they're seen as oppressed subjects, as victims of chauvinism, while at the same time a dangerous generalization of the terrorist threat. So what we saw in our subjects and our research participants was a desire to almost overcompensate on both of those dimensions. So to show I am empowered, I am an agent, but I'm not scary. Look at my smile. Like I'm smiling in my veil. And it resulted in a really severe, I think, cognitive load for these women who are constantly surveilled, not just by the state, as we heard about earlier, but by the public, and are having to occupy two dissonant personalities so that for whomever's looking at them, they're seeing the opposite of what they're most likely to see, I suppose. And I think it's a very, in this context, difficult position to be in, for sure.
A little bit like in Turkey, in Tunisia, actually the headscarf was banned under Ben Ali, which for a Muslim majority country is a problematic ban. So women who wore the headscarf knew that they went against, it wasn't a law, it was called a circular, against this more or less prohibition of wearing the headscarf. What to me is more problematic is that the majority of the women who did wear the headscarf are mostly rural women, less educated women, who in no situation were a threat to the state, who had no engagement with the state. They just wanted to go to the mosque and wear their headscarf. So, but they were treated as enemies of a state with which they did not engage. And that's why at the beginning I was saying, women to women solidarity. If it doesn't cross the social class divide, then the more secular urban Women's Rights Association would assert, oh yes, these headscarf wearing women are enemies of the state. Because they can't conceive of a woman just wanting to put on a headscarf because that's what she feels is religiously mandated.
One thing I will say that's interesting, is that there was a recent study who came out, and again, end of the day, I'm forgetting the authors, but they found in the United States that if you prime patriotism and then ask people their opinions about things like the Muslim ban, priming patriotism in the American context results in more open and pro-Muslim attitudes than not priming patriotism. And it's rooted in the freedom of religion ideas that we have in this country, I think. So I think there's a possibility for hope. It's not all security threat. There's another dimension of civil liberties that can provide a spark of hope, perhaps.
Can I just answer, can I say one thing very quickly? Sorry, I think that's a really interesting question, the way that the figure of the veiled woman shifts from being, being oppressed to being a threat. And you see it very clearly from the shift from the 1989 headscarf controversy, when the girls, I think secular French people said, we'll keep them in school because they should be in the schools of the Republic, because then they'll learn to take off the headscarf by themselves, right? Because they'll have like the values of the Republic. And then by 2004, the argument was that no, they're a security threat. They're the soldiers of green fascism, is what they were called. But I want to say two things there. One, I think what you're seeing is two things. One is obviously the effects of the war on terror, right, and the way that Islam is securitized. But I think the other thing to keep in mind, at least in France, and it's worth thinking about in this country, one of the arguments I make in my book is part of the reason for that shift is also a kind of declining faith that the institutions of the Republic will do their job in integrating immigrants. There's a kind of failure of the Republic itself and an anxiety about the capacity of the Republic and its institutions, right? The school, politics, all of these sorts of, the school especially. And so part of that, I think, is worth tracking, and I think it goes to Aubrey's comment about there's a kind of the anxiety that America is failing also, I think, and that its institutions are no longer capable of integrating its population and turning them into citizens. I think you might want to track that as well in this country, because it certainly plays a role in France in that shift.
I was just going to say briefly about the shift you mentioned. I know the legal scholar Sahar Aziz, she talks about this, and she sees it as kind of the shift from victim to terrorists, but but related. So the Muslim women are terrorists because the men, they're basically blindly following the men in their lives, right? So so they end up there. They don't have agency still, right? So they're terrorists and they're a threat, but it's only because they've been like pushed into it. So that's how she kind of sees it, at least in the U.S. context.
Yeah, thank you for these great talks. For Professor Gray, I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about some of these Islamist women. I'm just wondering to what extent we are thinking of them through a way that's kind of a caricature. So when you say, you know, they don't support gay rights, they think single mothers are immoral, is it possible that their positions are more complex than that, or maybe that's not relevant? I don't know. And my idea was the statement, something about, I think it was from the Butaja again, that we can never be free while our men are oppressed or something like that. I'm just wondering, do you think that, you know, she's making that statement kind of to the outside world and it's not internal to the community? So what's behind that is sort of, yes, you know, we are interested in gender justice, of course, but that's a conversation that's internal to the community and it's not really anyone else's business. So.
I mean, I've talked to probably 700 women, out of which 699 would definitely have said that gay rights cannot be part of an Islamic state, and single motherhood is not only immoral but criminal, and Israeli politics is the same as being Jewish. Now, I would say that many of the women I spoke were maybe not that very well educated in a Western sense. So maybe they were repeating something they had heard and had not really thought about so deeply. But it always came up in conversations with me because I'm obviously not an Islamist, or maybe I'm not so obviously not an Islamist, I don't know. But they assumed that I was none. And so they wanted to know where I stood on those issues. And when I explained, well, I defend your right not to be tortured for whatever you believe in, but here's where I stand. And then I've always gotten that response. And as I said, I don't think a woman who embraces such views should be raped or tortured or sent to jail. Absolutely not. But to me, the more interesting point is, or the more important point is, how do we engage across these divides? They are people, they are women who went through incredible suffering. So it must be possible we can find some common ground and say, I definitely defend your rights now that they are out of prison. But in return, you also need to give me a little bit of, you have to make a few concessions coming my way. And I think when, at a very basic level, when we respect each other as human beings and we uphold each other's rights, maybe that's utopian, but I do think we can find common ground. It's when we don't talk to each other and just sort of position somebody there and somebody there, that's when the conflict comes. But if we engage in conversations, I think it is possible that each side gives a little bit if we each promise each other to protect each other if human rights violations come our way.
I think I was asked, sorry, but just very quickly, I think yes and no. I think she is certainly saying we need to have an intra-community conversation about the question of gender equality. But I think she also, she's making a sociological point in some ways that the kind of structure of racism in France also produces certain forms of gender inequality and gender injustice. And to only think about the gender injustice is to think about a symptom rather than a cause, right? And so I think it's a more profound conceptual argument that's happening. I just want to, part of my paper was also just about, I think I would really like to think about the possibility of a politics that isn't about you give a little, I give a little, right? I want to sort of at least open the door to the possibility that I give without necessarily expecting anything in return. I support without necessarily expecting anything in return. And for me at least, part of coalition work is putting one's own identity at risk and putting one's own assumptions about what is the good and what is the right at risk. I don't.
So you would say anti-Semitism goes, homophobia goes?
No, but I would still not, I would support I would still work with them on issues that I think are important. Yeah. Yeah, and certainly, I don't really understand how it's a question, because I think you sort of, like, how do we support the human rights of women who fundamentally disagree with us and might want to throw us in jail? I think the unequivocal answer for me is yes. I just don't understand how part of political work is risk in all kinds of ways, ethical risks, political risks, epistemological risks, that was sort of, and then of course the struggle comes, right? And that was one of the moments that I was trying to track in my work, is precisely the kind of struggle.
But that's the conflict within Tunisia amongst the secular women's rights association,
right,
versus the Islamist associations, and the secular women's rights associations will not come to
the table.
Not at all.
Right.
Not when it comes to Islamist women.
So, Professor Gray, this is directed to you. As you were talking, a couple of things were going through my mind, but especially when you mentioned South Africa, and another example came to mind of the Kenya Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission. One thing that occurred to me was in the South African case, the word justice was not even there, neither was the word dignity. But I was interested, first of all, in the question of how do you restore dignity to a person?
Yes.
Because that's really important, especially when we think of the ways in which these transitional justice commissions end up being some sort of political compromise, rather than sort of a genuine attempt to reach at some kind of basic truths. And so the second question that comes to mind is, what are some of the critiques that you have about the commission in Tunisia, right? Because I think that's really important. And I was thinking about Mahmoud Mabdani's critique of the South African TRC, in which he poses the question, the title of his essay actually is Truth or Impunity, right? So anyway.
So, of course, restoration of dignity is, that was what the revolution was all about. What most people would say, the first and most important thing is that their grievances are acknowledged. Because there is still a significant part of the population who says, yes, those Islamists should have been in prison because they were enemies of the state. They did not unjustly suffer. So first of all, to acknowledge that torture, rape, kicking children out of school for a father who is in prison are not acceptable ways of engaging with the political opposition or religious opposition. So to acknowledge that these crimes occurred, I think is the first demand of all the people that I talk to. They say we want to be acknowledged not as criminals, but that we were prisoners of conscience, or that our spouse, our husband, was a prisoner of conscience. We were not criminals. So the first would be to recognize that they were imprisoned for their convictions and not for any criminal activity. And then the second that everybody is, of course, asking for is work. We need to have work so we can feed our families. You cannot lead a dignified life if you don't have enough money to feed your family. And that is very difficult in in the current Tunisian economic circumstances. They had several terrorist attacks on tourists, so tourism is one of the major industries, and so tourism has really plummeted. So it is very difficult to have this economic justice. And the other thing is, people who committed these crimes, there need to be criminal procedures. Like what happened in South Africa, to require reconciliation from above is very difficult. So one of the positions that Tunisia, the Truth and Dignity Commission took, is to have reconciliation must come from the victims. It cannot be state mandated. The victims must say, yes, we want to reconcile, or forgive, or whatever. That has, of course, been completely overturned recently with the new reconciliation law. You know, Tunisia gets always praised for its women's rights legislation, so they had a wonderful, or a really progressive violence against women law that got a lot of international publicity. What got very little publicity, that a month before, they passed a reconciliation law where it allowed for people who were involved in the Ben Ali regime to come back to and receive amnesty in Tunisia. That is maybe the first answer. My critique of the Truth and Dignity Commission is, it's maybe a little problematic, but in authoritarian countries, it's very difficult to establish truly democratic institutions. So the Truth and Dignity Commission is a very autocratic institution, very hierarchical, where the president runs the show and everybody who does not fall into place gets fired. So the Truth and Dignity Commission is down from 15 to 9 members because she either fired some or some people resigned in protest. So, and the other thing is that the Truth and Dignity Commission operates preferably in the urban centers, again marginalizing the already marginalized communities. So it's reinforcing the marginalization of rural populations that was the case under the previous regimes. So they haven't, in my view, sufficiently reached out or explained the mandate of the Truth Commission to rural, not so highly educated populations. So they have no understanding, or very limited understanding, what is the purpose of going to that commission. How many times am I supposed to tell my story? Because it is re-victimizing. So without really understanding what is ultimately the goal, or what do my family or me gain from continuously retelling our stories, that has not been clearly communicated by the Truth and Dignity Commission.
And in that sense, can it actually strip away? I mean, you've talked about dignity in economic terms, for example, but in social terms, how do you restore dignity, for example, to a woman who has been raped or to a man who has been sodomized, or, you know, do you know what I'm talking about? Because these are some of the problems with these public confessions. And re-victimization can happen on a number of levels, as indeed was the case in South Africa. And two, you can't put an economic value or cash value to someone's dignity. I mean, that's, so, anyway.
I mean, they have very practical recommendations, because I asked those questions. They said, we want our names to be recognized, and we want to have a public acknowledgement that we were not criminals. Many of the women said, I would like a little street to be named after me. Not a public square, just one tiny little passage, just as an acknowledgement. And then the third thing, to have memorial sites that recognize the victims, where their names are listed, or prisons turned into memorial sites, like what happened in South Africa or in Rwanda, where they have museums, turn prisons into museums, and honor in some way, shape, or form the people that languished there. So these are tangible ways, not economic, that would restore some measure of dignity.
So one more question.
It's late.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you all for presenting.